The year 2021 didn't arrive loudly. It crept in behind locked doors and flickering screens, carrying the promise that things would finally make sense again. But instead of answers, it left behind a trail of questions buried in police databases, archived forum threads, and case files stamped with words that felt heavier than closure ever should. In the early months of 2021, something subtle but unsettling began to surface, not as a single event but as a pattern that only revealed itself when cases were placed side by side. On paper, everything appeared ordinary. Reports were filed, investigations initiated, conclusions reached. Each case carried its own logic, its own explanation, its own official ending. But when viewed collectively, the similarities between them felt too precise to be coincidence. These were not dramatic errors or blatant cover-ups, they were quiet resolutions that arrived too quickly, as if the system itself had grown tired of asking questions. Police reports used familiar language, phrases repeated so often they became invisible. No foul play suspected. Cause undetermined but non-criminal. Evidence insufficient to proceed. Mental health factors may have contributed. Individually, these statements made sense. Together, they formed a script. In several cases, crucial evidence was acknowledged but dismissed in the same paragraph. A witness heard something but couldn't be verified. A door was found open but showed no signs of forced entry. A phone was recovered, but the final minutes of data were corrupted. Each detail was noted, then neatly folded away, never to be examined again. What stood out wasn't what investigators said, but what they chose not to pursue. Locations that were never fully searched. Time gaps that were rounded off instead of explained. Surveillance footage that existed but was never released, or worse, was said to be accidentally overwritten. Families were told there was nothing more to be done, that resources were limited, that continuing would only prolong their pain. The word resolved appeared again and again, even when nothing felt resolved at all. Online communities began noticing the pattern before professionals did. Amateur researchers, true crime enthusiasts, and data archivists started comparing notes across forums and comment sections. They pointed out how often cases from entirely different states shared identical procedural endings. How often the same types of anomalies appeared just before investigation stalled. How often officials discouraged further inquiry by framing it as irresponsible speculation. These observations were dismissed as paranoia, pattern-seeking behavior in an anxious time, yet the more people looked, the harder it became to ignore. Some of the most troubling cases were those officially classified as solved. Arrests were made, explanations offered, motives assigned. But the evidence supporting these conclusions often felt thin, held together by circumstantial reasoning and public pressure rather than certainty. In a year already strained by global fear and exhaustion, closure was prioritized over clarity. Communities wanted reassurance. Institutions wanted stability. And so, answers were provided, even if they didn't quite fit. There were instances where investigators themselves expressed doubt, only to retract their statements later. A detective would mention unresolved elements during an early press briefing, then fall silent as the case moved forward. A medical examiner would note inconsistencies in a report, followed by a final ruling that contradicted their initial observations. These moments passed quickly, overshadowed by headlines declaring the mystery closed, the threat contained, the public safe. The speed of these resolutions became a defining feature. Cases that once might have taken years were concluded in weeks. Leads that traditionally would have been followed were deemed inconclusive without explanation. In some reports, the investigative timeline seemed compressed, as if entire phases had been skipped. When questioned, departments cited staffing shortages, pandemic-related delays, and the need to allocate resources elsewhere. All reasonable explanations, yet they failed to account for the uniformity of the outcomes. Families and witnesses who pushed back often encountered resistance that felt procedural rather than personal. Requests for records were delayed. Appeals were met with form letters. Independent autopsies were discouraged. In a few cases, those who spoke publicly described being warned about the consequences of spreading misinformation, even when they were simply asking for clarification. The message was subtle but clear: the case was over, and reopening it would serve no one. What made this pattern especially unsettling was its invisibility. There was no single authority orchestrating it, no obvious hand guiding the narrative. Instead, it seemed to emerge naturally from a system under strain, where efficiency was valued over depth, and uncertainty was treated as a liability. Each case followed the rules, adhered to protocol, and ended with the appropriate documentation. Yet collectively, they told a different story, one of unanswered questions accumulating just below the surface. By the end of the year, dozens of such cases existed, scattered across jurisdictions, each carrying the weight of finality without the comfort of understanding. They sat in databases marked complete, their files closed but their details unresolved. Anyone examining them individually would find nothing overtly wrong. But anyone willing to look at them together would begin to sense that something essential had been lost in the process, that the act of closing these cases had become a substitute for actually solving them, leaving behind a silence that felt less like peace and more like something waiting to be disturbed. As the cases from 2021 continued to accumulate, attention shifted from how quickly they were closed to the strange details embedded within them, details that had been treated as irrelevant or coincidental at the time. These were the fragments that didn't fit clean narratives, the elements investigators noted and then dismissed, assuming they belonged to the noise surrounding any traumatic event. But when examined across multiple cases, those fragments began to echo one another in ways that were difficult to rationalize. It was no longer just about unanswered questions, it was about the same impossible details appearing where they had no reason to exist. Witness statements were the first to reveal the overlap. In different states, in unrelated environments, people described hearing sounds that defied context. Voices in places where no one should have been. Low, rhythmic noises reported at crime scenes hours after they were secured. Calls to emergency services that captured breathing, whispers, or faint tapping before abruptly cutting off. Individually, these accounts were written off as stress responses or audio interference. Collectively, they formed a pattern too specific to ignore. The descriptions used the same words, the same hesitations, the same attempts to explain something that felt just beyond comprehension. Physical symbols followed. Marks found at scenes were catalogued but rarely photographed in reports. A crude shape scratched into wood. A repeating pattern etched into concrete. A sequence of lines carved into metal surfaces that showed no signs of tool use. Investigators often concluded they were unrelated graffiti or environmental damage. Yet independent researchers noticed that the symbols were nearly identical in scale and structure, appearing in places hundreds of miles apart, often near locations where disappearances or unexplained deaths occurred. None of the official files cross-referenced them. Locations themselves began to overlap in ways that challenged geography. Certain coordinates appeared repeatedly in background data, not as primary scenes but as points of interest mentioned in interviews or phone records. A trailhead someone had visited weeks earlier. A vacant property passed during a commute. A stretch of road where multiple vehicles inexplicably lost signal. When plotted on a map, these places formed no logical route, yet they shared environmental characteristics that defied categorization. They weren't remote enough to explain the lack of witnesses, nor developed enough to account for the sudden absence of records. Technology, expected to clarify these mysteries, only deepened them. Digital evidence behaved inconsistently across cases. Audio files degraded in the same manner, losing clarity at identical intervals. Metadata timestamps shifted by minutes or hours without explanation. GPS data showed momentary pauses in motion where none should exist, as if devices had stopped acknowledging space itself. Experts attributed these anomalies to software glitches or hardware failure, but no comprehensive analysis was ever conducted to explain why the same failures occurred repeatedly under vastly different circumstances. Even human behavior showed unsettling similarities. Witnesses who initially gave detailed accounts later amended their statements, not to contradict themselves, but to remove specific elements. They would recall the sequence of events clearly, yet claim uncertainty about sounds, shapes, or moments of unease they had previously emphasized. Some said they had misunderstood. Others insisted they had exaggerated. A few refused to discuss the details at all, citing discomfort they couldn't articulate. There was no evidence of coercion, yet the pattern of retraction was unmistakable. What made these overlaps particularly disturbing was their resistance to classification. They did not align with known criminal behavior, psychological phenomena, or environmental factors. Each explanation offered addressed one detail while ignoring the rest. Investigators focused on what could be proven, leaving behind what could not be explained. Over time, these unexplained elements became footnotes, then omissions, disappearing from public summaries altogether. Online archives preserved what official records did not. Early drafts of reports, cached versions of articles, and screenshots of now-deleted posts revealed details that were later erased. When compared, the changes followed a consistent trajectory. Anything that suggested connection beyond the individual case was removed. Anything that implied recurrence was softened or eliminated. The narrative narrowed until only the most conventional interpretation remained. The repetition of these impossible details created a growing sense of unease among those paying attention. It suggested not randomness, but recurrence. Not coincidence, but structure. The same sounds, the same symbols, the same distortions appearing again and again, just far enough apart to avoid immediate detection. It was as if the cases were fragments of a larger story, each one incomplete on its own, yet collectively hinting at something moving quietly through the background of 2021, leaving behind traces that no one seemed willing to connect. As attention deepened and the overlooked details began to align, the third turning point emerged not through discovery, but through return. Evidence that had already been seen, catalogued, and dismissed started resurfacing in altered forms, as if the past itself was resisting erasure. These were not new clues pulled from hidden places, but old ones reappearing where they no longer belonged. Files once marked incomplete were quietly updated. Audio recordings thought unusable suddenly became accessible. Images previously deemed irrelevant began circulating again, stripped of context yet impossible to ignore. In several cases, investigators revisiting archived materials noticed discrepancies between original reports and what now existed in official databases. Statements appeared shortened. Descriptions were softened. Timelines that once contained precise minutes had been rounded into vague approximations. When earlier versions were recovered through backups or third-party archives, the differences were undeniable. It wasn't that facts had been corrected, it was that uncertainty had been removed. The evidence hadn't changed on its own. It had been curated. Audio evidence proved especially unsettling. Emergency calls recovered months after cases were closed revealed background sounds that had not been noted in transcripts. Low-frequency hums beneath human voices. Rhythmic tapping that didn't match environmental noise. Moments of silence that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate. In more than one case, technicians confirmed that these sounds existed in the raw files but had been filtered out during processing, categorized as interference. Yet the same filtering techniques had been applied across different jurisdictions, by different agencies, producing the same omissions. Deleted data followed a similar pattern. Phone records showed gaps that could not be explained by signal loss alone. Messages sent but never received. Location histories that skipped specific coordinates despite continuous movement before and after. Cloud backups that existed in billing records but could not be accessed. Service providers cited routine data purges, storage limits, or user settings, explanations that satisfied policy requirements but failed to explain the consistency of the losses. Visual evidence also resurfaced in unexpected ways. Photographs from scenes appeared online years later, posted anonymously or attached to unrelated discussions. These images often included elements never mentioned in official reports, marks on walls, objects placed at odd angles, doors, or windows that didn't align with described layouts. When traced back, their origins were difficult to establish. Metadata had been stripped. Upload histories led nowhere. Yet the images matched known locations with unsettling accuracy. Perhaps most disturbing was the reappearance of evidence through people rather than files. Witnesses who had gone silent reached out privately to journalists or researchers, offering fragments of memory they claimed had returned without warning. A sound they couldn't forget. A detail they had been told was irrelevant but now felt essential. Many described the same sensation, the feeling that something had been taken from their recollection, not erased entirely, but pushed aside until it could no longer be ignored. These returns were often accompanied by resistance. Requests to access updated records were denied on technical grounds. Agencies claimed the materials had always existed in their current form. Any suggestion of alteration was framed as misunderstanding or conspiracy. In a few cases, internal reviews were announced, only to conclude that no procedural errors had occurred. The message remained consistent, nothing had changed, and nothing needed to be reconsidered. Yet the evidence itself told a different story. Timestamps revealed edits made long after cases were closed. Access logs showed files opened without corresponding notes. Version histories hinted at revisions that had no documented justification. These signs were subtle, easily overlooked, but they accumulated into something difficult to dismiss. It wasn't the presence of new information that raised concern, but the quiet reshaping of old information to remove ambiguity. The resurfacing of evidence suggested intent, though not necessarily coordination. It felt less like a single effort and more like a shared instinct within systems designed to reduce uncertainty. Anything that complicated the narrative was smoothed away. Anything that resisted explanation was minimized. But the remnants could not be fully destroyed. They lingered in backups, in memories, in places beyond official control, waiting to be noticed again. As more of these altered fragments came to light, a troubling realization took hold. The truth had not been lost because it was hidden too well. It had been lost because it refused to stay simple. And every time it threatened to re-emerge in full, it was reshaped into something more manageable, leaving behind echoes that felt increasingly deliberate, increasingly incomplete, and increasingly impossible to ignore. As the altered evidence resurfaced and connections grew harder to dismiss, those who attempted to stitch the fragments together began to encounter a different kind of obstacle, one that did not appear in reports or databases. It emerged through absence. Journalists noticed interview requests going unanswered after initial agreement. Independent investigators found their emails bouncing back without explanation. Calls that rang endlessly were suddenly disconnected the moment certain details were mentioned. The deeper someone pushed into the overlap between cases, the quieter the response became. This silence was not dramatic or confrontational. There were no threats, no warnings issued in clear language. Instead, communication simply thinned until it vanished. A researcher would be actively collaborating with sources one day, then receive nothing but automated replies the next. A journalist granted conditional access to records would be told the files were temporarily unavailable, then informed weeks later that the request had expired. Each interruption was minor on its own, but together they formed a barrier that felt intentional without ever announcing itself. Digital spaces reflected the same pattern. Online threads discussing recurring details across cases were locked or removed for vague policy violations. Accounts sharing archived documents were suspended without clear justification. In some instances, entire discussion boards disappeared overnight, taking years of analysis with them. When users attempted to recreate the conversations elsewhere, links broke, images failed to load, and references led to dead ends. The information wasn't disputed, it was simply made unreachable. Even official channels seemed to retreat. Public records offices delayed responses beyond legal limits. Appeals were acknowledged but never processed. Meetings scheduled to review disputed conclusions were postponed indefinitely. When explanations were offered, they were administrative in nature, citing staffing issues, system migrations, or procedural backlogs. Nothing overtly malicious, nothing that could be challenged directly. The machinery of access slowed until it effectively stopped. Those closest to the cases experienced the most profound withdrawal. Family members who had once spoken openly to the press stopped responding altogether. Witnesses who had previously agreed to follow-up interviews declined without explanation. A few issued brief statements asking for privacy, their language noticeably similar despite coming from different regions. Others vanished from public view entirely, deleting social media profiles and changing contact information as if retreating from something they could no longer name. Attempts to reconnect the cases professionally were met with institutional discomfort. Editors hesitated to greenlight long-form investigations. Producers questioned the verifiability of patterns that crossed jurisdictions. Legal teams raised concerns about liability, not because of false information, but because of the implications of suggesting unresolved connections. The idea that something had been missed was acceptable. The idea that something persistent might still be operating was not. What made this silence unsettling was its timing. It did not occur at the outset, when skepticism would have been expected. It arrived only after enough material had been gathered to suggest continuity. It was as if a threshold had been crossed, not defined by proof, but by proximity. Once inquiries moved from individual anomalies to collective implication, the environment changed. Doors that had been open quietly closed. Some investigators described a growing sense of isolation. Collaborative efforts dissolved as colleagues disengaged, citing unrelated obligations. Shared documents stopped updating. Conversations drifted away from specifics towards safer abstractions. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense, but a reluctance that felt learned, as though pushing further violated an unspoken rule. The silence extended even into data itself. Files that had been accessible one day returned error messages the next. Links embedded in official reports redirected to blank pages. Search results that once surfaced relevant cases now buried them beneath unrelated material. Nothing was erased outright. It was simply made difficult enough to find that only those already aware would continue looking. In rare moments, someone would break through the quiet, offering a brief confirmation that others had noticed it too. A short message acknowledging inconsistencies, followed by a request not to be quoted. A phone call that ended abruptly once the conversation shifted from individual cases to collective patterns. These interactions suggested awareness without willingness, knowledge without permission. The growing absence became its own form of evidence. Not proof of conspiracy, but proof of boundary. It marked the edge of what could be pursued without consequence. The investigations did not end with a revelation or a confrontation. They faded, interrupted not by answers, but by the gradual withdrawal of every pathway that might have led to them, leaving behind a vacuum where inquiry once existed and a sense that whatever lay beyond that silence was not finished, only undisturbed. The final realization did not arrive as a revelation, but as a slow, unwelcome understanding that settled over those who had followed the cases closely. It became clear that the absence of answers was not the result of failure, incompetence, or even deliberate concealment in the conventional sense. Instead, it suggested something far more unsettling, that the truth had been partially seen, acknowledged just enough to be recognized as dangerous, and then deliberately set aside. These mysteries were not unresolved because no one could solve them, but because solving them fully would require admitting that something remained present, active, and unresolved beyond the boundaries of any single case. This realization emerged from the consistency of restraint. Again and again, investigations halted at the same invisible boundary. Officials were willing to explain accidents, crimes, and individual anomalies, but they avoided addressing recurrence. Patterns were treated as coincidence. Similarities were described as statistical noise. The possibility that events were connected was never directly refuted, it was simply ignored. This avoidance suggested not disbelief, but caution, as though acknowledging the pattern would force engagement with something no institution was prepared to confront. Those who reached this conclusion often described a moment when their perspective shifted. The cases stopped feeling like failures of justice and began to feel like compromises. The goal was no longer to uncover the full truth, but to contain it. By framing each incident as isolated and concluded, the larger structure remained invisible. The system functioned not to solve the mystery, but to prevent it from being fully formed. There were hints that some individuals within these systems understood more than they disclosed. Subtle language in internal memos. Hesitations during off-the-record conversations. The careful way certain questions were redirected rather than denied. These behaviors did not indicate ignorance. They suggested an awareness of limits, an understanding of where inquiry became something else entirely. Not illegal, not unethical, but destabilizing. What made this realization especially disturbing was its implication that the unanswered elements were not historical. They were not remnants of past mistakes or closed chapters waiting to be revisited. They pointed to something ongoing, something that had not ended with the filing of reports or the closing of cases. The repetition of details across time and place suggested continuity. Whatever connected these events was not confined to one moment or location. It persisted quietly, leaving traces that were noticed just long enough to be dismissed. This perspective reframed the silence encountered by investigators and journalists. It was no longer merely obstruction. It functioned as containment. By limiting discussion, by fragmenting information, by discouraging synthesis, the system ensured that no single narrative could fully emerge. The truth remained distributed across dozens of cases, none of which carried enough weight on its own to demand a reckoning. The idea that some truths are too disruptive to acknowledge openly is not new. Institutions have always balanced transparency against stability. But here, the balance seemed tilted toward preservation at any cost. Not of reputations or authority, but of normalcy. Admitting that something unexplained and recurring existed within the fabric of ordinary life would require a shift in how safety, predictability, and control were understood. It would mean accepting that not everything could be categorized, prevented, or resolved. For families and witnesses, this realization carried a different weight. It suggested that their experiences had not been invalidated because they were untrue, but because they were too true in a way that resisted explanation. The sounds they heard, the symbols they noticed, the moments they could not describe were not errors in perception. They were fragments of a larger reality that no one was prepared to integrate. This understanding did not provide comfort. It replaced uncertainty with unease. The mysteries of 2021 were not puzzles waiting patiently for the right solver. They were boundaries, marking the edge of what could be safely known. The lack of resolution was not a gap to be filled, but a deliberate space left open, maintained through silence and fragmentation. Once seen this way, the cases took on a different character. The closed files no longer represented endings, but checkpoints. The solved cases were not confirmations of understanding, but signals that inquiry had gone as far as it was allowed. The unsolved ones lingered not because they lacked answers, but because acknowledging those answers would require admitting that the phenomenon had not stopped, had not been contained, and was not confined to the past. The most unsettling implication of this realization was not that something unknown existed, but that it was being quietly accommodated. Adjusted for. Worked around. The system adapted not by confronting it, but by learning how to absorb its presence without naming it. And as long as it remained unnamed, it could continue, leaving behind stories that felt incomplete not because they were missing facts, but because the full truth was never meant to be assembled into a single, coherent whole, existing instead as scattered pieces that only hinted at what lay beneath, waiting not to be solved, but to be noticed just enough to remind anyone paying attention that some mysteries are left open not out of ignorance, but out of recognition that once fully acknowledged, they would demand a response no one is willing to give. By the time the year slipped quietly into memory, the cases remained exactly where they had been left, documented, categorized, and filed away under labels that implied finality without delivering it. To most, they became statistics, footnotes from a chaotic time best forgotten. But beneath that orderly surface, the pattern still lingered, unchanged and unresolved, like a presence that had learned how to remain invisible by never demanding attention. And for those who noticed the repetition, who felt the weight of the silence and the careful incompleteness of every answer, the stories never truly ended, because the unsettling truth was not that these mysteries belonged to the past, but that they had learned how to survive by becoming part of the background, waiting patiently for the moment someone looked at them together and realized they had never really gone away.